The morning of June 6, 1944, Neuville-au-Plain, France. Lieutenant Turner Turnbull pressed his cheek against the cold earth behind a hedgerow 40 yards north of the village, watching through his field glasses as the column approached. German infantry. Battalion strength, maybe more. Advancing south down the main highway towards Sainte-Mère-Église with mechanical precision, exactly as he'd anticipated. Behind him, 41 paratroopers of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment's Company D lay in carefully prepared positions along a gentle rise that offered perfect fields of fire, extending 600 yards to the north. Each man wore the distinctive paratrooper uniform, baggy jump pants with cargo pockets, leather jump boots, M1 helmet with the netting they'd used to camouflage themselves in the Sicilian campaign. Their faces were smeared with dirt and ash. Most hadn't slept in 24 hours. Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin van der Voort had positioned a 57mm anti-tank gun behind Turnbull's left flank, its crew already calculating range and deflection for the German armour they knew would follow the infantry. The mathematical equation was simple, brutal, but simple. 41 Americans against approximately 800 German soldiers, with more en route from Cherbourg. The Germans believed they were racing to reinforce Sainte-Mère-Église before the Americans could consolidate their hold on the town. They had no idea they were advancing straight into a killing zone that Turnbull had designed during the previous 2 hours with methodical precision. What the Germans couldn't have known was that getting surrounded at Neuville-au-Plain wasn't a disaster. It was exactly where Turnbull needed them to be. Close enough that American firepower would prove devastating. Committed enough that they couldn't easily withdraw. Concentrated enough that when the naval artillery arrived, there wouldn't be anywhere left to run. The trap wasn't set for the Americans. It was set for the Germans. And by the time they realized it, Turnbull's 41 paratroopers would have destroyed the equivalent of an entire German battalion and saved Sainte-Mère-Église from counterattack. All in approximately 6 hours of continuous combat. But to understand why this seemingly impossible defensive stand succeeded, we need to understand what had brought these 41 men to this particular piece of Norman farmland in the pre-dawn darkness of D-Day. The paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne Division had begun boarding their C-47 transport aircraft at airfields across southern England at approximately 2100 hours on June 5th. Major General Matthew Ridgway commanded the division, but his authority meant little once his men jumped from perfectly functional aircraft into the darkness over occupied France. Each paratrooper would land alone, carrying approximately 90 pounds of equipment, responsible for finding his unit, locating his objective, and executing his assigned mission with whatever resources remained after the drop. The 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, commanded by Colonel William Ekman, represented one of the 82nd's most experienced formations. These men had jumped into Sicily in July 1943, fought through the Italian campaign, and developed the kind of combat experience that couldn't be replicated in training. Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin van der Voort's 2nd Battalion had earned particular distinction during previous operations. Van der Voort himself epitomized the airborne officer tough, decisive, professionally competent, and absolutely committed to mission accomplishment, regardless of personal cost. The regiment's objective for D-Day was Sainte-Mère-Église, a small Norman town of approximately 1,500 civilians that sat astride National Route 13, the main highway connecting Cherbourg in the north, with Carentan to the south. Every German reinforcement moving toward Utah Beach or attempting to counterattack the American beachhead would have to pass through or near Sainte-Mère-Église. Controlling the town meant controlling German freedom of movement throughout the entire western sector of the invasion zone. The 505th's drop zones were located northwest of Sainte-Mère-Église, near the villages of Amfreville and Rouville. If the drop proceeded according to plan, the regiment would assemble rapidly, advance on the town, and secure it before German forces could organize effective resistance. But airborne operations rarely proceeded according to plan. The aircraft carrying the 505th crossed the Norman coast at approximately 1:30 hours on June 6th, flying at 500 feet altitude to minimize exposure to German anti-aircraft fire. What the pilots encountered wasn't minimal. German flak batteries opened fire with devastating accuracy, filling the night sky, with tracers and explosive shells that turned several C-47 seconds into falling torches. Pilots took evasive action, breaking formation, diving, climbing, anything to avoid the incoming fire. The careful navigation that was supposed to place each plane load of paratroopers precisely on their assigned drop zones disintegrated into chaos. But unlike most of the regiments dropping that night, the 505th enjoyed one critical advantage. Colonel Ekman's aircraft maintained course and dropped his paratroopers almost exactly on their intended drop zone northwest of Sainte-Mère-Église. Companies A and B landed within a mile of their assembly areas. Company C scattered but remained close enough to regroup quickly. The battalion staff, including Lieutenant Colonel van der Voort, landed near enough to establish command and control within hours rather than days. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Lieutenant Turner Turnbull landed approximately 1 mile northwest of Sainte-Mère-Église at 0 to 200 hours. The 23-year-old officer from Oklahoma had volunteered for airborne duty in 1941, when the concept of American paratroopers remained largely theoretical. His Choctaw ancestry earned him the nickname the Chief among his men, who respected his tactical judgment and his absolute refusal to accept defeat under any circumstances. Turnbull's platoon, 3rd Platoon of Company D, landed scattered across several fields but maintained sufficient cohesion to assemble at the designated rally point within 90 minutes. 41 men reported presence. Their equipment included M1 Garand rifles, several Browning automatic rifles, 2 light machine guns, bazookas, and enough ammunition for approximately 6 hours of continuous combat if they conserved their fire carefully. By 0330, Lieutenant Colonel van der Voort had, quote, established contact with Colonel Ekman and received his orders for 2nd Battalion. The battalion would advance on Sainte-Mère-Église immediately, secure the town, and establish defensive positions to repel the inevitable German counterattacks. Intelligence reports indicated that German forces in the area included elements of the 91st Luftland Infantry Division and possibly units from the 6th Parachute Regiment. Numbers were uncertain, but German reaction would be swift and violent once they realized American forces controlled the town. Major Edward Krauss led the 3rd Battalion into Sainte-Mère-Église at approximately 0 to 400 hours. The Germans had evacuated most of their garrison during the night, confused by paratroopers landing throughout the region and uncertain where to concentrate their forces. Krauss's men secured the town in a brief, sharp firefight that cost several American casualties but left Sainte-Mère-Église firmly in American hands. An American flag flew from the town hall by 0 to 500 hours. But controlling Sainte-Mère-Église meant nothing if German forces could counterattack with overwhelming strength from the north, south, or east. Van der Voort understood that his battalion needed to establish blocking positions on all approaches to the town. The southern and eastern approaches were covered by elements of 3rd Battalion. The western approaches led through marshland that provided natural obstacles. But the northern approach, National Route 13, leading down from Cherbourg, remained wide open. This was the road the Germans would use, the road they had to use if they wanted to reinforce their coastal defences or launch coordinated counterattacks against the invasion beaches. And this was the road that Lieutenant Turner Turnbull would defend with 41 men against whatever the Germans chose to send against him. Van der Voort found Turnbull at 0 to 500 hours near the northern edge of Sainte-Mère-Église. The two officers studied the terrain together. National Route 13 ran almost perfectly straight from Neuville-au-Plain south to Sainte-Mère-Église. The country on either side consisted of typical Norman bocage small fields, surrounded by dense hedgerows that created natural compartments ideal for defensive warfare. A low rise, approximately 40 yards north of Neuville-au-Plain, offered excellent observation, and fields of fire covering the highway and the surrounding fields for at least 600 yards. Vandervoort's orders were direct and unambiguous. Turnbull would take 3rd Platoon north to Neuville-au-Plain immediately. He would establish a blocking position on the high ground north of the village. His mission was to prevent German forces advancing from the north from reaching Sainte-Mère-Église until the 2nd Battalion could establish more comprehensive defensive positions. How long he could hold was uncertain. German strength advancing from Cherbourg remained unknown. But every hour Turnbull's platoon delayed the Germans was an hour the rest of the battalion could use to prepare Sainte-Mère-Églis's defences. Turnbull acknowledged the orders without comment. He understood what Vandervoort wasn't saying. 41 men couldn't stop a determined German battalion indefinitely, but 41 men in prepared positions with clear fields of fire could inflict catastrophic casualties on attackers before being overwhelmed. The question was whether those casualties would be sufficient to make the Germans reconsider their entire approach to retaking Sainte-Mère-Église. The platoon reached Neuville-au-Plain at 05:45 hours. Turnbull positioned his men with the care of a professional who understood that proper preparation meant the difference between successful defence and annihilation. The centrepiece of his defensive scheme was the 57mm anti-tank gun that Vandervoort had sent forward to reinforce the position. The gun crew established their position behind a hedgerow with excellent observation down the highway. They could engage German armour at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards, with reasonable probability of achieving kills. Turnbull placed his 2 light machine guns to create interlocking fields of fire across the highway and the fields on either side. The Browning automatic rifles occupied positions where they could provide rapid-fire support to any sector under attack. Riflemen filled the gaps between heavy weapons, each man responsible for a designated sector with predetermined landmarks to measure range. Most critically, Turnbull calculated artillery concentrations for every likely German assembly area within range of American guns. The 82nd Airborne had landed with field artillery battalions equipped with 75mm pack howitzers. These weapons could deliver devastating firepower against infantry caught in the open. Turnbull registered multiple concentrations with the artillery observers attached to 2nd Battalion, ensuring that when he called for fire, it would arrive within minutes at precisely the coordinates he specified. By 06:30 hours, the defensive position was as ready as 41 men could make it. Ammunition was distributed to ensure that no position would run dry during the critical phases of combat. Fields of fire were cleared of obstructions. Alternate positions were prepared in case the primary positions became untenable, and Turnbull had briefed every man on the withdrawal plan. When the position became indefensible, they would evacuate the wounded if possible, and fall back to Sainte-Mère-Église through covered routes that Turnbull had personally reconnoitred. The Germans appeared at 0 to 800 hours. Infantry advancing in battalion column down National Route 13, with the confidence of troops who believed they faced scattered American stragglers rather than a prepared defensive position. Turnbull watched them through his field glasses, calculating strength and composition. Approximately 800 men, veterans by their movement and discipline, advanced with the expectation of reaching Sainte-Mère-Église within 2 hours. The lead German company reached the 600-yard mark at 08:15. Turnbull let them continue. The farther into his kill zone they advanced, the more devastating his opening fire would be. At 400 yards, the German column extended across most of Turnbull's defensive front. Perfect. Turnbull's opening signal was simple. The anti-tank gun fired first, its shell whistling down the highway to strike a German truck near the head of the column. The vehicle exploded, blocking the road and creating immediate chaos among the German infantry. Within seconds, both machine guns opened fire, raking the highway with interlocking streams of tracers that cut through the German formation with devastating effect. The Battle of Neuville-au-Plain had begun, and for the next 6 hours, Turner Turnbull's 41 paratroopers would demonstrate why prepared defensive positions held by determined troops could destroy attacking forces regardless of numerical superiority. The German reaction to Turnbull's opening volley revealed both their experience and their fundamental miscalculation about American strength. Within 90 seconds, the lead German company had taken cover in the ditches flanking National Route 13 and begun returning fire with rifles and machine guns. German mortar teams established firing positions behind the column and began dropping high explosive shells on American positions with reasonable accuracy. But the Germans' return fire accomplished little against American paratroopers positioned behind hedgerows with overhead cover. Turnbull's men had learned in Sicily that survival in defensive combat depended on minimizing exposure while maximizing fields of fire. They fired from prepared positions, exposed themselves only long enough to engage specific targets, and immediately shifted to alternate positions when German counterfire concentrated on their locations. The German battalion commander faced an immediate tactical problem. His mission required reaching Sainte-Mère-Église rapidly to support the defense against the American beachhead at Utah. But the Americans blocking his route had demonstrated firepower, suggesting much larger strength than a single platoon. German doctrine called for reconnaissance to determine enemy strength before committing major forces. But reconnaissance took time the Germans couldn't afford. The German commander chose aggression. At 08:45, 2 companies of German infantry advanced off the highway to flank Turnbull's position from both east and west. The maneuver was textbook infantry tactics: fix the enemy in place with frontal fire, while enveloping both flanks to strike from unexpected directions. Against a platoon-sized force, the maneuver should have succeeded within 30 minutes, but Turnbull had anticipated exactly this response. His defensive position wasn't designed to stop flanking maneuvers. It was designed to channel flanking maneuvers into predetermined killing zones, where American firepower could devastate them. When the German companies advanced into the fields on either side of the highway, they encountered hedgerows that restricted their movement and limited their fields of fire. More critically, they advanced into sectors where Turnbull had registered artillery concentrations. The call for fire went out at 08:50. Within 3 minutes, American 75mm pack howitzers began dropping shells on both German flanking columns with precision that stunned the German commanders. The Americans weren't firing random, harassing fire. They were executing pre-planned concentrations that had been calculated to catch German forces in specific locations during specific phases of their attack. The German companies on both flanks took catastrophic casualties. Men caught in open fields with no overhead cover faced shell fragments traveling at supersonic velocities that cut through flesh and equipment with equal efficiency. The survivors pulled back toward the highway, abandoning their flanking attacks and concentrating behind whatever cover they could find. By 09:30 hours, the German battalion had been decisively repulsed in its first assault. Casualties exceeded 150 men killed and wounded. The Americans had suffered 3 men wounded, none seriously enough to require immediate evacuation. The mathematical calculation that should have guaranteed German success had failed because it hadn't accounted for American artillery and prepared defensive positions. The German commander now faced the dilemma that would define the entire engagement. His orders required reaching Sainte-Mère-Église, but forcing the American position would cost casualties that might cripple his battalion's combat effectiveness. Intelligence reports were coming in from other sectors, indicating American paratroopers had landed throughout the region. The situation remained confused. The careful plan that was supposed to see German forces crushing scattered American units had disintegrated into dozens of small battles, where local commanders made decisions based on incomplete information. The second German assault began at 1000 hours. This time the Germans committed their entire battalion, advancing on a broad front designed to overwhelm the American position through sheer weight of numbers. German mortar fire intensified, attempting to suppress American defensive fires long enough for the infantry to close with the American positions and engage in close combat, where German numerical superiority would prove decisive. Turnbull's platoon met the assault with disciplined defensive fire that reflected their training and combat experience. The machine gunners fired in short, controlled bursts, calculated to maximize ammunition efficiency while maintaining devastating rates of fire across their assigned sectors. The BAR gunners engaged specific targets, German officers, NCOs, machine gun teams, eliminating the leaders and specialists whose presence held the attack together. The riflemen fired with mechanical precision, each shot aimed, each shot accounting for one more German soldier who would never reach the American positions. The artillery support intensified. American forward observers adjusted fire in real time, walking concentrations across German assembly areas and approach routes with precision that demonstrated the superiority of American fire control procedures. The Germans had numerical superiority, the Americans had artillery superiority, and in defensive warfare, artillery superiority typically proved decisive. By 10:30 hours, the second German assault had collapsed. The battalion had lost an additional 200 men without gaining a single meter of ground toward the American positions. The survivors pulled back beyond effective range and established defensive positions of their own, no longer attempting to advance, but rather attempting to prevent the Americans from counterattacking. Turnbull observed the German withdrawal with professional satisfaction. His ammunition supplies remained adequate for several more hours of defensive combat. His casualties totaled 7 men wounded, with 4 still capable of fighting. Most critically, he had accomplished his mission. The German battalion advancing from Cherbourg had been delayed for over 3 hours, suffered casualties approaching 40%, and showed no immediate signs of renewing their attack. But Turnbull understood that the tactical situation remained precarious. German reinforcements would arrive. His position would eventually be flanked by forces moving cross-country through sectors his 41 men couldn't possibly cover. And the longer he remained in position, the more likely the Germans would identify his actual strength and realize they were being held up by a single platoon rather than a company or battalion. The German prisoners captured during the fighting provided valuable intelligence when questioned by American interrogators. They reported that their battalion had been advancing toward Sainte-Mère-Église with orders to link up with German forces, defending the town, and prevent American paratroopers from consolidating their positions. The prisoners expressed confusion about American strength, estimating they had faced at least company strength and possibly battalion strength based on the intensity of fire they'd encountered. This psychological dimension of the battle proved as important as the physical casualties. The Germans advancing towards Sainte-Mère-Église believed they faced determined American resistance in strength. They had no way of knowing that the resistance consisted of 41 men under a 23-year-old lieutenant who understood that defensive warfare was fundamentally a question of geography and firepower rather than numbers. Lieutenant Colonel Vandervoort monitored Turnbull's situation from his command post in Sainte-Mère-Église through radio communications and observer reports. By 1100 hours, he recognized that Turnbull's platoon had bought the critical time 2nd Battalion needed to establish comprehensive defensive positions around the town. But he also recognized that leaving Turnbull in position much longer would result in the platoon being surrounded and destroyed when German forces finally committed sufficient strength to overwhelm the position. Vandervoort dispatched 1st Lieutenant Theodore Peterson with 1st Platoon to reinforce Turnbull at 11:30 hours. Peterson's mission was to establish a fallback position between Neuville-au-Plain and Sainte-Mère-Église that would allow Turnbull to conduct a fighting withdrawal without exposing his men to devastating fire during their movement. The concept required careful coordination and precise timing, but it represented standard airborne doctrine for defensive operations: hold as long as possible, withdraw before becoming decisively engaged, establish new positions, repeat as necessary. But before Peterson's platoon could reach Turnbull's position, the tactical situation changed dramatically. German observers north of Neuville-au-Plain reported American paratroopers preparing defensive positions and called for artillery support. By 1200 hours, German artillery began falling on American positions with increasing accuracy, forcing Turnbull's men to take cover and limiting their ability to observe German movements. More critically, German forces were beginning to infiltrate around both flanks of Turnbull's position, moving through bocage country, where their advance remained concealed until they were dangerously close to American positions. By 1300 hours, Turnbull reported to Vandervoort that German forces were approaching from 3 directions, and his position would become untenable within the hour. Vandervoort's response demonstrated the kind of tactical flexibility that characterized successful airborne operations. If Turnbull couldn't hold Neuville-au-Plain, he would withdraw to Peterson's fallback position. But before withdrawing, he would call for naval gunfire support on the German forces concentrating around Neuville-au-Plain. The 82nd Airborne had naval forward observers attached specifically for this purpose. American warships offshore could deliver devastating firepower, far exceeding anything available from field artillery. The call for naval gunfire went out at 1330 hours. The fire control procedures required careful coordination between ground observers, naval liaison officers, and the warships themselves. But by 1345 hours, the USS Nevada had received firing coordinates and prepared to engage with its 14-inch main battery. The impact of naval gunfire on ground targets resembled nothing in the German experience. The Nevada's 14-inch shells weighed nearly 1,500 pounds each and contained several hundred pounds of high explosive. When they detonated, the explosions created craters 12 feet deep and 30 feet across. The concussion alone could kill men hundreds of feet from impact. The fragmentation patterns devastated everything within a 100-yard radius. The Nevada fired 18 shells at German positions north of Neuville-au-Plain between 1345 and 1400 hours. The German battalion that had been preparing to renew its attack on Turnbull's position ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Survivors reported later that the naval bombardment had killed or wounded more than 200 men and destroyed their entire command structure. The battalion withdrew north toward Cherbourg in disorder, no longer capable of offensive operations. Turnbull withdrew his platoon from Neuville-au-Plain at 1400 hours, conducting a textbook retrograde movement under cover of Peterson's supporting fire. By 1430, both platoons had established new defensive positions south of the village, and Turnbull was making his report to Vandervoort. The platoon had held off a German battalion for more than 6 hours, inflicted casualties approaching 500 men killed and wounded, and accomplished every aspect of its assigned mission. American casualties totaled 3 men killed and 18 wounded, with most of the casualties occurring during the final German artillery bombardment rather than the earlier infantry assaults. The tactical success at Neuville-au-Plain exemplified principles that would define American airborne operations throughout the war. Small units in prepared defensive positions with superior fire at support could achieve results vastly disproportionate to their numerical strength, but those results required professional leadership, thorough preparation, disciplined execution, and most critically, the understanding that defensive warfare was fundamentally about controlling terrain that channeled enemy attacks into killing zones. Turner Turnbull survived the engagement at Neuville-au-Plain only to be killed the following day, June 7th, by German mortar fire while supervising defensive preparations at Sainte-Mère-Église. He never received the recognition his tactical achievement deserved during his lifetime. But Lieutenant Colonel Vandervoort's after-action report praised 3rd Platoon's performance as a small unit performance that has seldom been equalled in the entire history of the 82nd Airborne Division. The strategic impact of Turnbull's stand at Neuville-au-Plain extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. The German battalion's failure to reach Sainte-Mère-Église on June 6th meant that American forces consolidated their hold on the town with minimal interference. The casualties inflicted on German forces reduced their capacity to mount coordinated counterattacks against Utah Beach during the critical first 48 hours of the invasion. Most importantly, the engagement demonstrated to German commanders throughout the region that American paratroopers weren't scattered remnants waiting to be mopped up. They were professional soldiers executing coordinated plans with devastating effectiveness. The German perspective on the engagement at Neuville-au-Plain revealed how completely American airborne operations had disrupted German defensive planning throughout Normandy. Colonel Helmut von der Heydte commanded the 6th Parachute Regiment, an elite German airborne formation responsible for defending the eastern Cotentin Peninsula against precisely the kind of American airborne assault that materialized on June 6th. Von der Heydte was 50 years old, a veteran of operations from Crete through the Eastern Front, and one of Germany's most experienced airborne commanders. His after-action reports compiled during the weeks following D-Day provided detailed insights into German operational confusion during the critical first hours of the invasion. Von der Heydte's regiment occupied positions east of Sainte-Mère-Église when American paratroopers began landing throughout the region shortly after midnight. The initial reports reaching his headquarters suggested scattered American drops with no apparent pattern or coordination. German intelligence had predicted American airborne operations might precede any amphibious assault, but the scale and dispersion of the drops exceeded anything German planners had anticipated. By 0 to 300 hours, von der Heydte had received reports of American paratroopers landing in dozens of locations across a front, extending more than 20 kilometers. Some reports indicated platoon-sized forces. Others suggested company or even battalion strength. The confusion stemmed partly from German units reporting every contact with American forces as a major engagement, creating the impression of far larger American strength than actually existed in any single location. But the confusion also reflected genuine American operational effectiveness. The scattered drops that seemed disorganized to German observers were actually accomplishing exactly what American planners intended, disrupting German communications, creating uncertainty about American objectives, and forcing German commanders to disperse their forces to address multiple threats rather than concentrating against any single American position. Von der Heydte's attempts to coordinate defensive operations during the early morning hours of June 6th demonstrated the German dilemma. His orders from 7th Army headquarters directed him to prevent American forces from consolidating control of Sainte-Mère-Église and to maintain contact with German coastal defense units. But executing those orders required moving his regiment through terrain now infested with American paratroopers, whose exact locations and strength remained unknown. The German battalion that encountered Turnbull's platoon at Neuville-au-Plain belonged to the 91st Luftlande Infantry Division, a formation created in January 1944, specifically to counter airborne threats in occupied France. The division's commander, General Wilhelm Falley, had been killed during the early morning hours of June 6th when his staff car encountered American paratroopers while returning to division headquarters from Rennes. Falley's death eliminated the one German commander in the immediate area who understood airborne operations and could have coordinated effective responses to American drops. The battalion advancing toward Neuville-au-Plain had received orders at 0 to 600 hours to move south through Sainte-Mère-Église and establish defensive positions covering the approaches to Utah Beach. The battalion commander, Major Karl Schmidt, understood that speed was essential. Every hour's delay allowed American forces landing at Utah to expand their beachhead and move inland. Schmidt's intelligence briefing indicated scattered American paratrooper groups in the area, but suggested no major American formations had consolidated positions blocking his route. Schmidt's battalion consisted of approximately 830 men organized into 4 rifle companies, a heavy weapons company with machine guns and mortars, and a headquarters element. The men were veterans, having served in defensive operations along the Atlantic Wall since early 1944. Their training emphasized aggressive counterattacks to eliminate American forces before they could establish defensive positions. German doctrine assumed that scattered airborne forces, isolated from their heavy equipment and artillery support, could be defeated through rapid maneuver and concentrated firepower. When Schmidt's lead company encountered Turnbull's opening volley at 08:15 hours, the German reaction followed standard procedures. Take cover, return fire, assess enemy strength, execute flanking maneuvers to envelop American positions. But every phase of this textbook response encountered problems that German doctrine hadn't anticipated. American fire intensity suggested much larger forces than a scattered paratrooper group. American artillery support arrived with precision that indicated professional forward observers and established communications networks. Most critically, American positions had been prepared with clear fields of fire and overhead cover that made them extremely difficult to suppress with the weapons available to a German infantry battalion. Schmidt's radio reports to regimental headquarters during the engagement revealed growing frustration with the tactical situation. His first assault had failed with heavy casualties. His attempts to flank American positions had been devastated by artillery fire. His battalion was taking casualties at rates that would render its combat ineffective within hours, yet he could see no evidence of American strength sufficient to justify these casualties. The Americans were fighting from concealed positions, making accurate assessment of their numbers impossible. German prisoners captured during the engagement provided information that would have seemed incredible to German commanders if multiple sources hadn't confirmed it. The American force blocking National Route 13 consisted of approximately 40 men under a single lieutenant. No tanks, minimal heavy weapons, no prepared fortifications beyond hasty field positions. Yet this force had stopped an entire German battalion, inflicted 500 casualties, and held its position for 6 hours against repeated assaults. The psychological impact on German troops who survived the engagement was profound. These were experienced soldiers who understood infantry combat. They recognized that being stopped by a larger, better-equipped force was the inevitable result of unfavorable tactical conditions. But being stopped by a force 1/20th, their size suggested something fundamentally wrong with German tactical doctrine or German execution, or both. General Erich Marx commanded the 84th Corps, responsible for defending the Cotentin Peninsula against Allied invasion. Marx was 53 years old, a highly decorated officer who had lost a leg on the Eastern Front but remained in active command. His headquarters at Saint-Lô received fragmentary reports throughout June 6th about combat operations across his entire area of responsibility. The pattern that emerged from these reports was deeply troubling. German forces outnumbered American paratroopers in every engagement. German units possessed heavier weapons, better communications, and interior lines, allowing rapid concentration of forces. Yet German forces were losing these engagements, taking disproportionate casualties, and failing to prevent American consolidation of key terrain. The engagement at Neuville-au-Plain represented just one example of a pattern occurring throughout the American airborne drop zones. Marx understood that the fundamental problem wasn't German tactical competence or soldier quality. The problem was that American airborne forces were executing a style of warfare that German doctrine hadn't adequately prepared for. American paratroopers weren't attempting to hold continuous defensive lines. They were seizing key terrain, establishing strongpoints, and using superior firepower to destroy German forces attempting to maneuver past them. Each American strongpoint functioned independently, but contributed to an overall defensive scheme that prevented German forces from concentrating effectively against the invasion beaches. The material superiority that American forces demonstrated at Neuville-au-Plain and elsewhere shocked German commanders who had grown accustomed to material advantages during early war campaigns. American artillery ammunition appeared unlimited compared to German supplies. American communications equipment allowed precise coordination between ground forces and fire support assets. American medical capabilities meant that wounded paratroopers received treatment that German soldiers could only imagine. Staff Sergeant Robert Murphy commanded one of Turnbull's machine gun teams during the engagement at Neuville-au-Plain. 24 years old from Pennsylvania, Murphy had joined the 82nd Airborne in 1942 and fought in Sicily and Italy before participating in the Normandy invasion. His post-action testimony provided detailed insights into how American paratroopers achieved such devastating effectiveness despite minimal numbers. Murphy's position covered approximately 200 yards of highway with interlocking fire from his Browning 1919 machine gun. The weapon fired .30 caliber ammunition at rates approaching 500 rounds per minute, creating beaten zones that made movement through its field of fire suicidal for attacking infantry. Murphy's crew consisted of himself as gunner, Private James Wilson as assistant gunner, and Private Edward Harris as ammunition bearer. The crew had positioned their weapon behind a hedgerow, with excellent observation down National Route 13. They had cleared fields of fire by removing small vegetation that might obstruct their view. They had prepared alternate firing positions connected by shallow trenches that allowed movement between positions without exposure to German fire. Most critically, they had stockpiled ammunition at each position 3,200 rounds, distributed across their primary and alternate locations, sufficient for approximately 6 minutes of continuous fire, several hours of disciplined, aimed fire at specific targets. When the German column appeared at 08:15 hours, Murphy waited for Turnbull's signal before opening fire. The discipline required for this wait exemplified the difference between trained soldiers and armed civilians. Murphy could see German infantry walking openly down the highway, completely exposed, offering perfect targets. Every instinct demanded immediate engagement, but Murphy understood that premature fire would alert the Germans before maximum numbers had entered the kill zone. Waiting those critical 90 seconds meant the difference between destroying a German company and merely disrupting it. Murphy's first burst killed 6 German soldiers and wounded at least 8 more. The tracers from his weapon converged with tracers from the second machine gun position 400 yards to his right, creating a crossfire that swept the highway clean of standing targets within 15 seconds. German soldiers dove for cover in the ditches flanking the road, but the ditches offered concealment rather than protection. Murphy's gun fired in short bursts calculated to maximize accuracy while conserving ammunition, walking fire along the ditch line and eliminating German soldiers attempting to organize return fire. The German response demonstrated their training and combat experience. Within 3 minutes, German mortar teams had established firing positions and begun dropping high-explosive shells on suspected American positions. German machine gunners identified likely American locations and fired suppressive bursts designed to force American defenders under cover. German officers and NCOs organized small assault teams to rush American positions during pauses in American fire. But every German tactical response encountered American counter-responses that suggested superior training and better equipment. When German mortars fired, American artillery counter-battery fire eliminated the mortar positions before they could execute sustained bombardments. When German machine guns fired, American rifles eliminated the gunners with precision marksmanship that reflected hundreds of hours of training. When German assault teams attempted to rush American positions, they encountered fire from unexpected angles that indicated American defenders had prepared multiple positions and coordinated their fires to cover all approaches. Murphy's crew fired approximately 800 rounds during the engagement, achieving an estimated kill ratio exceeding 1 German casualty for every 10 rounds fired. This effectiveness reflected not just Murphy's skill, but the superior characteristics of American weapons and ammunition. The Browning machine gun was inherently more reliable than comparable German weapons, suffering fewer stoppages and requiring less maintenance. American ammunition manufacturing standards ensured consistent performance, with failure rates measured in single percentages, rather than the double-digit rates that plagued some German ammunition lots. The integration of artillery support with small unit defensive fires represented perhaps the most critical American advantage. When Turnbull called for artillery concentrations on German flanking movements, the shells arrived within 3 minutes at precisely the coordinates specified. This responsiveness required sophisticated communications equipment, trained forward observers, professional artillery crews, and ammunition supplies that never seemed to run low regardless of expenditure rates. German forces possessed artillery in comparable quantities, but German fire control procedures required significantly more time to process requests and execute missions. German forward observers used different radio frequencies than artillery units, necessitating relay through intermediate headquarters. German artillery batteries occupied semi-permanent positions that made rapid displacement difficult. German ammunition supplies faced constant constraints as Allied bombing campaigns disrupted transportation networks throughout occupied France. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The naval gunfire support that devastated German forces north of Neuville-au-Plain at 13:45 hours represented a capability that German forces simply could not counter. The USS Nevada had been commissioned in 1916 and modernized extensively during the 1930s. Her main battery consisted of 10 14-inch guns mounted in twin turrets, capable of firing shells weighing 1,490 pounds to ranges exceeding 23,000 yards. The fire control systems aboard Nevada incorporated range-finding equipment, mechanical computers, and trained personnel who could calculate firing solutions accounting for target movement, wind conditions, and projectile ballistics. When naval forward observers ashore called for fire, the Nevada could respond within minutes with accuracy that exceeded anything available from field artillery. The 18 shells fired at German positions north of Neuville-au-Plain represented merely a tiny fraction of Nevada's total ammunition expenditure on June 6th. The battleship fired over 300 14-inch shells throughout the day, supporting ground operations across the entire Utah Beach sector. The psychological impact of naval gunfire on German troops was profound. Soldiers who had survived Eastern Front operations described naval bombardment as exponentially more terrifying than any artillery fire they'd previously encountered. German survivors of the Neuville-au-Plain engagement reported that the naval bombardment had eliminated all cohesion within their battalion. Officers and NCOs were killed or wounded at disproportionate rates because they exposed themselves while attempting to reorganize their units. Communications equipment was destroyed by shell fragments and concussion effects. Men who survived physically intact suffered psychological trauma that rendered them incapable of executing coordinated tactical maneuvers. The German withdrawal north from Neuville-au-Plain after the naval bombardment represented not tactical repositioning but organizational collapse. The battalion that had advanced confidently towards Sainte-Mère-Église 8 hours earlier retreated as scattered groups of survivors who had abandoned their heavy equipment and sought only to escape American firepower. German commanders attempting to rally these survivors for renewed attacks discovered that the men refused to advance toward American positions, convinced that any attack would result in annihilation by superior American weapons. Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Vandervoort's evaluation of the Neuville-au-Plain engagement emphasized factors that transcended Turnbull's platoon's immediate tactical success. The engagement had demonstrated that American airborne forces could achieve strategic effects through tactical actions that seemed insignificant when viewed in isolation. 41 men holding a road intersection for 6 hours represented nothing in terms of casualty statistics or terrain captured. But those 6 hours allowed 2nd Battalion to establish comprehensive defences around Sainte-Mère-Église. Those 6 hours prevented German forces from launching coordinated counterattacks against Utah Beach during the critical initial phase of the invasion. Those 6 hours created psychological effects within German units that reduced their combat effectiveness during subsequent engagements. The 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment's operations on June 6th demonstrated the effectiveness of American airborne doctrine across multiple engagements beyond Neuville-au-Plain. Major Edward Krause's 3rd Battalion secured Sainte-Mère-Église and held it against repeated German counterattacks throughout the day. Lieutenant Colonel Edward Krause's leadership exemplified the aggressive, mission-focused approach that characterized successful airborne commanders. Colonel William Ekman coordinated regimental operations from his headquarters in Sainte-Mère-Église, maintaining communications with battalion commanders and adjusting defensive positions as the tactical situation evolved. Ekman understood that airborne operations required decentralized execution combined with centralized intent. He provided his battalion commanders with clear objectives and sufficient resources, then allowed them tactical freedom to accomplish their missions using whatever methods local conditions suggested. The 505th's performance on D-Day earned formal recognition through unit citations and individual decorations. But the more significant recognition came from German commanders whose after-action reports identified American airborne forces as the decisive factor, preventing effective German responses to the invasion. General Marx's final report before his death on June 12 stated explicitly that German forces had been unable to concentrate effectively against the invasion beaches because American paratroopers had seized critical terrain and established defensive positions that German forces could not bypass or reduce without suffering prohibitive casualties. The strategic calculation that justified American airborne operations emphasized their effectiveness in disrupting enemy operations rather than seizing and holding terrain. Pre-invasion planning recognized that paratroopers would suffer heavy casualties and might not accomplish all assigned objectives. But planners calculated that even partial success would create sufficient disruption within German defensive plans to justify the casualties and resource expenditures required for airborne operations. The Neuville-au-Plain engagement validated this strategic calculation at the tactical level. Turnbull's platoon hadn't held the position indefinitely. They'd withdrawn after accomplishing their mission and before being destroyed. But during the 6 hours they held Neuville-au-Plain, they'd prevented an entire German battalion from reaching Sainte-Mère-Église, inflicted casualties that rendered that battalion combat ineffective for subsequent operations, and demonstrated to German commanders throughout the region that American paratroopers represented threats requiring major resource commitments to eliminate. The material and logistical dimensions of American airborne operations provided foundations for tactical success that German forces couldn't match. American paratroopers jumped with approximately 90 pounds of equipment, including weapons, ammunition, rations, medical supplies, communications gear, and specialized equipment for their assigned missions. This load represented careful calculation of what individual soldiers could carry while remaining combat, effective after landing. But the individual equipment represented merely initial supplies. American airborne doctrine assumed that resupply would arrive within hours through either air delivery or link-up with ground forces advancing from the beaches. The C-47 transport aircraft that delivered paratroopers could return with equipment bundles, ammunition, and reinforcements. Gliders could deliver jeeps, anti-tank guns, and other heavy equipment that paratroopers couldn't jump with. This logistical capability meant that American airborne forces became more formidable over time, rather than weaker as initial supplies were expended. German airborne forces had demonstrated similar capabilities during the Crete operation in May 1941, but by June 1944, German logistical capabilities had deteriorated to the point where German airborne units functioned as elite light infantry rather than as true airborne forces, with strategic mobility and sustained combat power. The 6th Parachute Regiment, defending against American drops in Normandy, consisted of experienced soldiers with airborne training, but they lacked the transport aircraft, supply capabilities, and doctrinal flexibility that characterized American airborne operations. The technological advantages that American forces demonstrated at Neuville-au-Plain extended across every aspect of military operations. American radios were lighter, more reliable, and offered better range than German equivalents. American weapons fired more reliably and required less maintenance. American ammunition demonstrated better consistency and performance. American medical supplies included innovations like plasma and sulfur drugs that dramatically improved survival rates for wounded personnel. These technological advantages reflected fundamental differences in industrial capacity and research priorities between the United States and Germany. American industry could produce weapons and equipment in quantities that seemed unlimited compared to German production rates constrained by Allied bombing campaigns and resource shortages. American research establishments developed solutions to operational problems identified through combat experience, creating continuous improvement cycles that German forces struggled to match. The human dimension of American success at Neuville-au-Plain deserves emphasis equal to discussions of equipment and doctrine. Turner Turnbull had volunteered for airborne duty when such service involved significant risks of training accidents and uncertain prospects of combat effectiveness. His Choctaw heritage provided no particular advantage in tactical situations, but his determination to excel as an airborne officer drove the thorough preparation that made his platoon's defense successful. The 41 men who followed Turnbull into defensive positions at Neuville-au-Plain had volunteered for airborne service, knowing they would face exceptional dangers. Airborne training during World War II was deliberately brutal, designed to eliminate anyone who lacked the physical capability or mental determination to survive combat jumps and subsequent operations behind enemy lines. Men who completed airborne training understood they represented elite formations expected to accomplish difficult missions with minimal support. This self-selected warrior culture created cohesion and combat effectiveness that transcended organizational structures and equipment capabilities. Men who had volunteered for extraordinary danger and survived extraordinary training developed confidence in themselves and their comrades that proved decisive during combat operations. When Turnbull's platoon faced German forces outnumbering them 20-1, they didn't panic or consider surrender. They executed their assigned mission with professional competence, confident that their training, leadership, and fire support would allow them to achieve success despite numerical disadvantage. German soldiers facing Turnbull's platoon possessed comparable individual courage and tactical competence. German infantry training emphasized aggressive tactics and combined arms coordination. German NCOs typically demonstrated professional expertise exceeding that of their American counterparts in terms of technical military knowledge. But German forces in Normandy suffered from strategic disadvantages that individual competence couldn't overcome. German soldiers understood by June 1944 that Germany faced overwhelming Allied material superiority. They'd watched German cities burned by Allied bombing campaigns. They'd experienced supply shortages as Allied attacks disrupted transportation networks. They'd received replacements who lacked the training and experience that earlier German forces had possessed. These factors created psychological vulnerabilities that American forces exploited through aggressive tactics and overwhelming firepower demonstrations. The aftermath of the Neuville-au-Plain engagement rippled through German defensive planning for the remainder of the Normandy campaign. German commanders recognized that American airborne forces would continue to conduct similar operations whenever tactical conditions favored such actions. German responses emphasized concentration of forces to prevent isolated units from being destroyed piecemeal, but concentration reduced German tactical flexibility and created targets for American artillery and air power. The 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment continued operations in Normandy for 33 days after D-Day, participating in the reduction of German defensive positions throughout the Cotentin Peninsula. The regiment's casualties during this period totaled 916 killed and wounded from an initial strength of approximately 2,000. These losses reflected the brutal nature of bocage fighting, where every field became a potential battleground, and German defenders utilized terrain advantages to offset American material superiority. But the regiment accomplished its strategic objectives, contributing to American seizure of Cherbourg on June 27th and subsequent operations that secured the entire Cotentin Peninsula. The 82nd Airborne Division returned to England in mid-July for rest, refitting, and preparation for future airborne operations. Division casualties in Normandy exceeded 4,600 men, representing nearly 50% of the division's D-Day strength. Turner Turnbull was buried in the American Cemetery at Normandy, one of 9,387 American servicemen interred at the site overlooking Omaha Beach. His grave marker provides his name, rank, unit, and date of death. It doesn't mention the engagement at Neuville-au-Plain or the tactical achievement his leadership represented, but his memorial stands among those of countless other American soldiers who accomplished extraordinary things during the Normandy campaign, their individual contributions forming the collective achievement that secured Allied victory in Western Europe. Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Vandervoort survived the war and remained in military service, eventually rising to brigadier general before retiring in 1960. His evaluations of Normandy operations consistently emphasized the importance of junior leader initiative and small unit effectiveness in accomplishing strategic objectives. Vandervoort argued that American success in Normandy resulted not from overwhelming material superiority alone, but from the combination of adequate resources with professional leadership at every level of command. The tactical lessons from Neuville-au-Plain influenced American military doctrine for decades following World War II. The emphasis on prepared defensive positions, integrated fire support, and disciplined execution under pressure became fundamental principles taught at every level of military education. Modern American military operations continue to reflect these principles, adapted for contemporary technologies and tactical environments, but maintaining the core concepts that proved effective at Neuville-au-Plain and countless similar engagements. The psychological dimension of the engagement deserves final emphasis. Turnbull's 41 paratroopers understood they faced overwhelming odds. They understood their position would eventually become untenable. They understood casualties were inevitable and survival was uncertain. Yet they executed their mission with professional competence, maintaining discipline under fire and achieving results that seemed impossible based on numerical analysis. This psychological strength reflected more than individual courage. It reflected organizational culture that emphasized mission accomplishment over personal safety, professional competence over comfortable assumptions, and collective effectiveness over individual survival. American airborne forces cultivated this culture deliberately, recognizing that paratroopers would face situations where conventional military thinking suggested surrender or retreat represented the only rational options. The Germans at Neuville-au-Plain possessed comparable physical courage and technical competence, but they lacked the organizational culture and material support that allowed American forces to maintain effectiveness despite numerical disadvantage. German doctrine assumed numerical superiority would eventually prove decisive through sustained pressure and exploitation of any weakness in enemy defenses. This assumption proved correct in many previous campaigns, but at Neuville-au-Plain and throughout Normandy, German numerical superiority encountered American firepower superiority, and firepower proved more decisive than numbers. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.